Hi, BookTube. Welcome to another nonfiction review. I've been really excited about this one. I think everybody's got that feeling. If they've watched my other videos, I keep hinting at this review that's to come. And that's because this is another one of those works looking at a niche bit of history, a forgotten corner. And in this case, it's a forgotten corner of American history. In 1813, there were several thousand Americans living in Britain against their will, a small town's population. Their story was never well known, and even what did become known was not often accurate. Our author, who's a professor of American history teaching at Cambridge, wanted to set the record straight. Today, we're reviewing The Hated Cage, an American tragedy in Britain's most terrifying prison by Nicholas Guyatt, published in 2023. Since we have this brand new little, what am I going to call it? Brand new opening thing. Let's talk about prices right away, because you'll see that I've checked out Amazon UK and Amazon US. UK Kindle readers right now, if you're interested in this book, it has gone down in price to 99 pence. You'll see my question, though, that I put on this slide, which is, why are US Kindle prices? Why are they so expensive? In the UK, you can get a lot of deals. If you're browsing on Amazon regularly, you will find really good books suddenly marked down to a very good price. But these are the prices that I found online just before I went to record. The cheapest second-hand paperback copy that I found online was £3.98, and that price did include delivery, so there are some good deals out there for this book. Right, another picture. This picture, though, it's so important because this book covers the period of the War of 1812, so I have to bring that in. And what I'm showing you right now is a shelf on our messy bookshelves, one shelf which is completely devoted to the War of 1812. And that's because the person who watches television has a particular interest. He likes a good deep dive into that war. He's been reading about it for several years now. He has books written by American, British, and Canadian writers because he wants to get a mix of viewpoints. It was a war that you took sides on. Absolutely. So it's important to get different points of view. I would really like eventually to read Pierre Berton's history of the war. Berton is a Canadian historian. So it was the person who watches television who discovered this book. So I own it, but I only own it in the sense that the person who watches television owned it. He purchased it during my Read What You Own challenge year. So I couldn't buy books, but he could do what he liked. And he bought this at Foyles, I think last May, read it immediately, quoted to me from it. I could tell he was really excited about it. And I was excited because I had absolutely no idea that this was an event in American history. And here's our lovely author information. I think it's important to read from the book Nicholas Guyatt himself talking about how he discovered the truth about the history of Dartmoor Prison, which is in the southwest of England. I will put up a map shortly, because of course I seem to want to just cover my face for the whole of this review. But there's such a lot of information to give you. It's important. So on page 4, Guyatt says, "As a historian of the United States who teaches in Britain, I'm embarrassed to admit that I found out about the Dartmoor massacre entirely by accident. On vacation in Devon, I dragged my family into the car to tour the bleak uplands of Dartmoor National Park. An hour later, I more or less drove into the prison. For a portion of the 19th century and nearly all of the 20th, Dartmoor was a high-security facility. It was home to political prisoners and hardened criminals, and it became a byword for remoteness and despair. Most Britons would be surprised to learn that Dartmoor had been built during the Napoleonic era to serve as a war prison, a strangely transitory purpose for a huge granite building. The graves of 271 American prisoners of war outside the prison reveal its true origins and the heavy cost paid by those Americans who were brought to Dartmoor between 1813 and 1815. Okay, I'm back. So let's talk about the structure of the book before we go into the content. The book is 419 pages long, but only 360 of those are the text. I didn't find the text presentation, it's not the greatest. The text is single-spaced, so it does look dense on the page, and I know that can be a bit intimidating. But I think what Guyatt does to compensate for that is he has a really lovely, kind writing style. I reviewed a few pages of text just to see what kind of sentences he was using. And most often he seems to like a two-clause sentence. So in other words, subject, verb, object, comma, and or subject, verb, object. And it's a nice size. It allows for the presentation of a lot of information within one sentence, but not too much. And I did like that. I also found he didn't use a lot of complex vocabulary you wouldn't use in everyday speech. He tried to keep it casual, sometimes maybe a little too casual. On page 147, he said, being in the wrong place in the wrong time was Beasley's superpower. That's not a way of writing that an academic would put into a history text normally. So I do think he's trying to be friendly. And I also felt that Guyatt did something that a lot of nonfiction writers, I wish they would do, and that was mention the date a little bit more often. Sometimes you get at the head of a chapter the mention of a date, and then it's never mentioned again. And if the author should need to go back and forth in time to give you additional information, do you find I get lost? I think, what year is this that we're in again? And are we in July? Are we in January? Because it really matters. And Guyatt was kinder than most in that he would repeat the year and the month. He didn't seem to mind that. And I was grateful for that personally. This isn't a reference-heavy nonfiction text. It's got some illustrations, 17 of them in black and white. To be honest, unless you get the hardback copy of this book, I don't think those illustrations are good quality. And I'm sure they wouldn't be on the Kindle version either. Then there is some notes at the back, about 35 pages, and the bibliography information is included with those notes. And then there's a subject index. So it's not trying to be a highly academic work. I do feel that this was just get them an introductory look into this corner of history. Let's talk about, though, what I did find really noteworthy about this book, and I'm going to mention this as a thing in itself, is that Guyatt seems to be deliberate, very deliberate, in his effort to give equal attention to the African American prisoners in Dartmoor. There are first-hand accounts that have been written by white Americans, but not by black American prisoners. And Guyatt also takes a lot of page space to counter some of the misleading information that did come out about black prisoners, which was invented and popularized in the early 19th century in articles and books that were published after the war. But those were often written by men who'd not been prisoners themselves. They just managed to get a hold of some written accounts, and they used that as a basis for their own story. He also notes that Dartmoor's white prisoners petitioned the prison authorities to segregate the black inmates. And I'm going to put a picture up now on screen because the black American prisoners were given their own accommodation in Block 4. And you can see from this illustration that Block 4 is walled off from the other blocks. So there were about 777 black inmates. And Guyatt brings together multiple documents that were written during and after the incarceration. And there is enough convincing evidence that Block 4 became a lively cultural, intellectual, and spiritual center that was attracting the white prisoners back to it. In fact, there were a few white prisoners that chose to be incarcerated in Block 4. There's evidence that there was a school, evidence that there were theater productions, evidence that there were regular church services in Block 4. Guyatt really goes out of his way. I think he mentions on his Cambridge webpage, his research interest, that he has a particular interest in looking at race in the history of America. And so he really takes time. His first chapter and his last chapter really zoom in on the African American experience in Dartmoor. Now I'm going to do that thing where I go through the book chapter by chapter and just give a quick summary of what's in there so you can get a fuller idea of what you'd get from the book. Chapter 1 begins, it's called A Seafaring Life, and it describes the journey that was made by foot by those first American prisoners who were sent to Dartmoor. And it also describes the nature of seafaring work in America around the time of independence, and what a seafaring life could and could not offer to Black American sailors. Chapter 2, Getting Clear. This is talking about America being a work in progress after the War of Independence, and how they had to choose how they were going to defend themselves against European powers, because, of course, at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and I'll talk about this more, America still wasn't recognized in the way it should have been as a sovereign nation. And it had to make a decision about how was it going to deal with these infringements on its autonomy. And there were two views of how there was a Jeffersonian and a Hamiltonian view, a vision of America's future. Jefferson wanted an agricultural economy. He didn't want any cities. Hamilton believed that America needed to develop industry and therefore some urbanization in order to be competitive globally. So the chapter takes a closer look at that. And chapter 3 is called Spare the Vanquished. This is all about how Dartmoor Prison came to be built. But more than that, how the whole concept of a prison was coming to be in the late 18th, early 19th century. Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and others were talking about how should you imprison? What should you do with men who offend in society? How should you treat them? And so those social ideas help to inspire all prison building, but in particular Dartmoor. And then, of course, Guyatt talks about the challenges of building a prison in a remote area like Dartmoor, where the weather's very unpredictable and the ground can often be too wet. And so he goes through all that as well. Chapter 4, Among the Romans, talks about how Dartmoor's first prisoners of war were French, of course, captured during the wars with Napoleon. And Guyatt describes their plight before and after the Americans arrived to join them. And chapter 5, The Unhallowed Pursuit. This was what America decided to do, and I will talk about this more, how they used privateers to combat the Royal Navy. And there are 3 accounts of privateer lives at sea before and during the War of 1812. Those are very fascinating. And on pages 136 to 139, in particular, they talk about Black privateers and how the 1813 Seamen's Act deprived them of some previously documented citizenship. You do want to check that out if you're interested in Black history and the realities, things that have been forgotten. Black sailors had effectively been given a certificate of citizenship, which was made redundant or ineffective after 1813, but it did exist before 1813. Chapter 6 focuses on a gentleman called Reuben Gaunt Beasley. He was the U.S. representative for American prisoners of war in Britain. Was he incompetent? Was he derelict in his duty? Or was he actively hostile towards the men he was supposed to represent? This chapter looks at that from all angles and really examines how much Beasley's hands were tied by the British authorities. Chapter 7 is called Extreme Necessities. Now it looks at how did the prison run logistically after they added many hundreds of American prisoners. And there are some interesting personal stories gleaned from looking at the prison ledgers, the record keeping. In particular, the number of men who volunteered to be released and to serve in the British Navy, which says something about just how bad conditions at Dartmoor were. Chapter 8 is called A World in Miniature, and that starts to take a look at the social minutiae of life in Dartmoor Prison. Clothing, daily routines, food, internal governance, because there was internal governance within each prison block, economy, entertainment, what happened if the prisoners had wives and children, etc. And chapter 9 in the middle is Prison 4. Now it talks about the 777 Black prisoners who were segregated to Block 4 at the request of their white American colleagues. Colleagues? Well, compatriots? I'm not sure what word you might want to use. No written records, unfortunately, survive that were kept by Black prisoners. That doesn't mean they didn't necessarily write them. There was evidence that they could, but They didn't get kept and it didn't get preserved. Guyatt has to use white accounts, therefore, that were written during and after incarceration. And he's got to analyze, read between the lines, compare that with prison records to try to reconstruct a possible reality of life for those men. I was really interested in those accounts because they showed that Block 4 was a really alive place, and no other prison block is mentioned in quite the same way. So I just find that really interesting. It's unfortunate that there just isn't more record kept of life in that block. So chapters 10 to 14, they talk about how things degenerated. First of all, they talk about the end of hostilities between Britain and the United States, and how, even so, the process of releasing and repatriating those prisoners at Dartmoor took months. It was not, there wasn't, equipment and supplies available to get those men across the Atlantic Ocean. And so demoralization set in, and chapter 11 talks about the inevitable crisis, which was badly handled by the British authorities. And there was a massacre on the 6th of April, 1813, and there's some detail. Again, Guyatt tries to reconstruct what happened based on witness testimony that was later done. And of course, chapter 12 then talks about the perils of journeying home. It wasn't a simple journey, and it was particularly perilous for Black Americans, because if they weren't taken to the northern states, they faced going into slavery. Then chapter 13 talks about all the accounts that did come across the Atlantic and how they were published and how accurate they were. And I think finally then in chapter 14, Guyatt, because his focus is always on race in American history, this chapter, it goes along the same lines as Michael Harriot's Black AF history, but it's focused on just events around the War of Independence and the War of 1812, trying to pull out the truth about what really happened. And again, it's a fascinating chapter. I said I would go down a rabbit hole. This rabbit hole will be a bit tedious for anyone who already knows a lot about the War of 1812. So I apologize, but I know that I have a lot of readers who aren't American. And just because you're American doesn't mean that you're an expert on the War of 1812. It tends to get lost because there's the Civil War and the War of Independence. But the War of 1812 is also important. It's sometimes called the Second War for American Independence. And I'll read you a quote from the book, which just shows what state America was in just after its independence when the Napoleonic Wars began. So this is quoting George Washington in his farewell address of 1796. He urged Americans to take advantage of their, quote, detached and distant situation to remember that, quote, Europe has a set of primary interests, which to us have none or a very remote relation. But Washington, Guyatt says, was no isolationist. Americans should, quote, extend our commercial relations with Europe while having, quote, as little political connection as possible. But the problem with wanting to be only as connected as America wanted was Europe was more powerful militarily, and Britain was the greatest military power at the time on the seas. So the war started effectively because Britain ignored American autonomy in order to serve their political interest, which was fighting Napoleon Bonaparte. The Royal Navy would go looking for American ships, and they would capture the sailors on them, and those sailors would be forced to serve on Royal Navy ships. And so America was forced into a conflict with Britain because it had to work out how is it going to protect its citizens at sea who were doing trade. Commercially, the war did benefit America because while France and Britain were at war, both sides needed supplies, which American private commercial ships could give them. But of course, there was always the danger that you'd have those ships captured by the British or by the French. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison decided that it wasn't effective to build a navy. America could not at that point build a navy that could rival Britain, so there was no point spending all that money there. What they decided to do was outsource their maritime fighting to private vessels. And I'll read an extract now from page 120, which talks about Jefferson's thinking about this use of private vessels to fight the British. Guyatt says, could the United States outsource the maritime fighting of the War of 1812 to private vessels crewed in part by foreigners or itinerants? Absolutely, thought Jefferson. It would be folly to fund a large navy and go head-to-head with the capital ships of Britain. Instead, the United States government should, and this is quoting Jefferson, leave the war on the ocean to our privateers, which would, quote, immediately swarm in every sea and do more injury to British commerce than the regular fleets of all Europe would do. And indeed, this is what happened. But of course, what it meant was that it turned many seamen into soldiers overnight. And while the Jefferson-Madison strategy was probably the most workable solution in this situation, it also gave Britain a greater sense of justification in attacking American ships, and it was the captured men on those ships that were taken to Dartmoor prison. So I do have some recommended reading in this situation. W. Jeffrey Bolster is professor of history at the University of New Hampshire. Back in 1998, he wrote a book called Black Jacks, African American Seamen in the Age of Sail. And Guyatt quotes him often, and I think this book could be quite interesting if Guyatt's work interests you in what it was like to be on the seas as a Black American in the late 18th, early 19th century, because that life at sea was a strange one. You knew what nationality you were when you were at sea, but the sea is boundless. And I think it created an interesting opener, not too open for Black Americans still, but slightly opener, freer life for them for that period of time that they were serving as seamen. So I think I'd be interested in Bolster's book just to find out more, if there are more lives that you'll find then some written records, some diaries or something which weren't kept at Dartmoor. That would be fantastic. And that's another review done. Right, what am I going to do next time I post content? I am writing a little essay at the moment because I've never really put my thoughts out there about what to do about this issue of separating art from the artist in situations that we're finding now. Alice Munro, for example, Neil Gaiman, Marion Zimmer Bradley, Cormac McCarthy. We're finding out the private lives of many authors, and they're full of things that are a little disturbing. What do you do about the art? What do you do about what they wrote? I think I have a different take on that. Or maybe what I should say is I would like to play devil's advocate with that subject matter. So I'm going to do a sideline on that. Look out for that midweek. And then, of course, I believe next weekend it's time for Middlemarch meditation. Yeah. So that's what you can look forward to coming up. In the meantime, everybody, happy reading. Hope you're doing well with whatever it is, whatever goals you've set yourself. And I'll see you again next time. Take care. Bye-bye.